that the New Testament was written in Aramaic. Especially is the definition of words important. Like many, the Jews think that it's satisfactory to them to have the Old Testament from the Hebrew and the New Testament from the Greek. But there are words that are translated that if you don't know what they are in Aramaic, you won't get the definition in the Greek. Now, what did I just say?
You don't know one language, you won't get it in the other language.
And if all you ever have is the Hebrew or the Greek, then what did I say?
You missed it completely.
And if you missed it completely, what else did I say? You
have
won't.
to know what language it was written in to see whether the translation is correct.
Like last week, we went back, all the way back to the beginning. And we defined the name Cain. And we defined the name Abel. And we defined the name Adam and Eve. And we defined the name Melchizedek. But what we didn't define is the word priest. Melchizedek was a priest. Now, what most people don't understand is that Melchizedek being a priest, that doesn't mean a lot if you're trying to study from Roman Catholicism. Because Roman Catholicism takes the Hebrew translation and translates it into Latin. And to be frank with you, I don't know if they have that distinction, if Jerome was smart enough to pick it up, and if he would have translated it as the original Hebrew had it. In case he did, I say pluses and bonuses to Jerome. If he didn't, I'd say they just don't know. Where you see the priesthood of Roman Catholicism is based on the priesthood of the Old Testament Levitical priest. Now, with a little bit of that as an understanding, we turn to the book of Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, and the 1st verse. There's a phrase that says, let's just read the 3rd chapter and the 1st verse. And the Bible says,
Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus.
now I can tell you, you do not understand that verse. The reason I can tell you you don't understand it is that you've not had a chance to understand it. The reason you've not had a chance to understand it is that it's been translated from the Greek. The reason it's improper is that the Aramaic is far more definitive than the Greek. In the Greek language, the word for priest is kana, or kana. You speak it, I don't. And you say it and pronounce it any way you want to. In the Hebrew, it's our word Cohen. If you run into anybody that's got the last name Cohen and they're Hebrews, are from the Jewish background, they are something you have thought of as priests, but that still is not defined as we'll define it a little bit later. In the Aramaic, there's a totally different word. The word kumria is translated, or is mentioned, or written in the Hebrew language. It is used some 24 times in the New Testament. And if it was written in the Aramaic, it would have been translated in the Greek the same way it's translated, but it would still be a mistranslation because it's a misunderstanding. Melchizedek was a priest of God. Now the word kana infers or intends for you to understand that this was from the tribe of Levi.
No.
Totally. The first time that a priest was mentioned, though, what did not exist? Levi. So how can you be from the tribe of Levi when Levi wasn't here kicking around? But there was another word that was used also to show you how definitive and distinct this is. Kana is the direct cognate of the Hebrew word Cohen, and therefore designates a priest from the traditional Levitical lineage. But the second word that we're going to be talking about, Kamriah, appears several times in Hebrews, but is never translated justly because the translation that most people use is the Greek. We've translated it from the Greek. This verse is nothing short of genius for the person who studies the scriptures, particularly if you have, and I have to thank my middle son, Bobby, for getting me these things because I wouldn't have known them either. Of course, if I'd have done like a lot of people, just left them laying around and not used them, I still wouldn't have had it, even though I had it. You know what I mean? But fortunately for me, I've always been somebody that could look up something on the last second of a moment and find what I was looking for and didn't have enough sense to know that I could have looked at it for a long time, but I just hadn't done so. So before I left tonight from the house, I decided I'd look up the Aramaic word that was in Genesis 14 and 18. You want to look over at Genesis 14 and 18 for me, please?
Wow, are you saying Aramaic was before the Hebrew?
No, sir. I'm saying in the Hebrew, the right word is used, but in the Greek, it's mistranslated. Read.
It says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem or Salem,
Salem.
brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God.
Okay. Priest is the word I'm after, because that's where we'll start. We're on Melchizedek. And this may take me another week, but if you get bored, I feel sorry for you. Where is, another thing that always bothered me, and I never could make it figure in my mind, but it wasn't important enough to spend a lot of time to try to study. What was Moses' father-in-law?
It's in Egypt.
No, he
High
wasn't.
priest.
No, he wasn't. His
His
father-in-law.
father.
His wife's dad.
There you go.
Okay.
It was not an Egyptian.
Jethro.
Jethro's my man. What was he?
The Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, Jethro or Reuel was Moses' father-in-law, a
Canaanite.
Canaanite, shepherd and priest of
He
Midian.
was what?
Priest.
He was the high priest of Midian.
It doesn't say high priest, it just says priest.
Read the King James, I think you'll see that it says he was the high priest of Midian, and maybe not. Who was Joseph's father-in-law?
He was a priest in Egypt. He
He's
was
more than that.
the high priest.
He was the high priest of Egypt. Guess what their name was not written as.
Those words on the board.
Yeah, it was too, in the Hebrew,
What?
but not translated.
Joseph's father-in-law, his name was
You pronounce that, I got a quarter for you.
Potipharah. It can't be potty. It can't be potty. Just be a dumb name.
Potiphar.
It's split up. It's split off.
I dig it. What book, chapter, and verse?
I don't know. Just
Google.
Genesis 41:45.
Genesis 41:45.
And 41:45. So, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name.
Hot dog.
Give me a nickel for this one.
I'll give you a nickel.
Zephnath-Paneah.
I'll give you a quarter if you pronounce Joseph's wife's name. But that's all right. Go ahead.
And he gave him to wife
Mrs.
Asenath. Asenath.
Get your closer.
Asenath.
Yeah. That was just part of it, though. But the point is, he was what?
The priest of On.
Oh, he was what?
Priest of On.
And guess what? Joseph's father-in-law was not called a Jew. You see, if you were a Jew, you would have been called a Kana or a Cohen. Guess what? Moses' father-in-law was not called a Jew. And of course, when his word, our name, our description, our job description was given, he would not have been called Cana, however you want to pronounce it. Again, you speak it, I can spell it. They were called Kamria.
They were called by the Arabic word,
Yes, sir. That's the word.
originally written that way.
That's in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic. That's the word that is used.
When Moses wrote this,
Yes, sir.
he used that word.
Yes, sir. Kamria.
Okay, that's where it comes.
Now, guess what? 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, and the 9th verse uses for the word priest in the Aramaic. And guess what was used of Melchizedek as priest in Genesis 14:18? And guess what we have just found out? The genius of God is displayed. There were two distinct, separate words for the word priest. One meant you had to be a derivative from or of Levi. The other one ignored Levi. The boy just might as well not have existed. Now, read 1 Peter 2:9.
1 Peter 2:9 says, "You're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood."
Ah! Now, when the Roman Catholics read this, guess what they think?
They're the chosen generation.
Yeah, man, they put their shirt on backwards and they think they came from Levi. Because that's what they were trying to emulate to bring the Jews in to their denomination in the 5th century. But guess what the word is? You're a Kamria. That means it has nothing to do with Judaism. The power of the argument is that instead of using the Hebrew derivative, the translator into the Greek used a general definition that is against the writing and has spread a lot of confusion in this world. Now, turn to Psalms 110. Let's read about this boy Melchizedek again. Because was Melchizedek a Jew?
No.
You know, this was the discussion I had with my friend today. He thought that Melchizedek was Seth. Now, I have had in my life some very able instructors, some by just sheer fortune, and I thank God for it, and some in debate, and some in study, and some by accident. I found out something I just didn't know, not intending to find out. Read Psalms 110.
Psalms 110, verse 1 through 7,
Let's just go 1 through 4.
1 through 4. A psalm of David. The Lord said unto my Lord, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Thy power shall be willing in the day of thy power.
No,
Thy people, shall be willing in the day of thy power.
don't mess us up. When they're wrong, I'll tell you. But go ahead.
In the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning, thou hast to do with thy youth.
And you know, I'm going to preach on that one Sunday morning because there's nobody. My mama used to go around and quote that all the time. And I thought, that's pretty. What did it mean? I don't know, but it sounded pretty. Read it again.
Thy people shall
No,
be,
in the beauty of the morning.
in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning, thou hast to do with thy youth. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
Guess what Hebrew word is used there?
That come from here.
Kamria.
That's
Do
not
you
Hebrew.
see, sir?
Aramaic.
That's Aramaic. Well, in the Aramaic, it's translated that way from the
Okay,
Hebrew.
so you got me confused tonight. Are you saying the Aramaic existed before?
No,
Okay, all right,
I'm saying to the Hebrew, if you could read Hebrew,
all right.
you wouldn't need the Aramaic when reading these verses because the different word is there. I'm saying that when they translated it and they came to this word, they used the derivative of the Greek. And the Greek derivative is a general word for priest, which was Cohen or Kana or Kana.
Now, how are you convinced that this Aramaic word is the word that's there, or should have been used there, or should have been translated?
Because I got a Hebrew Bible and I've got a Hebrew dictionary and it tells me it's so. And I've got 3 or 4 Hebrew lexicons and I've got a bunch of other things that tells me that.
So which word means Levitical priesthood and which one means patriarchal?
Okay, and Christian.
Yeah, which one? Which words?
Well, they can't. Are you from Levi?
No,
Yes.
which word means Levitical priesthood? Which word means Levitical priesthood?
Which word means a literal priesthood?
Levitical.
Levitical priesthood.
Yes.
Kana or Kana. And Kamrea or Kamria or you pronounce it, I can spell it. Means priest. See, with the word Kana, it has a definition that is definitive only in the fact that you came from the loins of Levi.
So how is Cumria patriarchal when patriarchal was before Mosaical?
Well, leave your hands down. How many what?
Can you hear me?
How was,
Yeah, but that causes it to be distorted.
how is Cumria, say it again and I'll translate it for you.
So how is Cumria used to differentiate the patriarchal when,
Because it was a word that the patriarchs used in distinction.
but it's in Aramaic, which didn't exist.
No, in the Aramaic translation, you get the correct Hebrew word. In the Greek translation, they didn't fool with it.
So
They didn't distinguish whether it was the Levitical priesthood or the patriarch.
Well, they came to the word priest, they just put
Well,
that.
you're saying the distinction is which word they used.
And the word is from the Hebrew. That's where it should come from. But since the Old Testament is really in the King James, a translation of the 1650s, not from the original Hebrew.
But doesn't the word Cohen mean bridge builder as if to speak between that stand between man and God?
Yeah,
All right, okay, so I'm missing your Aramaic inference here. I'm not able to apply what you're using in the Old Testament.
All right, let me try this. Our boy Mel
He
was not a kinfolk of Levi.
All right.
He was before Levi.
Our boy Jethro, oh, that's weird, was not a kinfolk of Levi.
Okay.
A child of God
It's not.
is not a kinfolk of Levi.
Gotcha. All right.
And it's a genius stroke to know that this is true. And guess what? When Jesus was made a high priest, which word was used?
Camaria.
Exactly.
Okay, that part I understand in the New Testament. I haven't grasped the idea of using the Aramaic definition in the Old Testament. I haven't got there yet.
Well, you got a Spanish translation? I bet it's right. If Maria was here, we could get a Spanish translation, and I'd almost guarantee you that they used the right word. Because the Spanish translation of the Bible in the Old Testament comes from many hundreds of years later translation. But it's far more correct.
And priest meaning a representative for God.
A bridge builder.
Bridge builder for God.
But the name gives it an orientation that we have not picked up on. Now, of the 24 times that this word is used in the epistles, all 24, which refers to children of God, comes from the Aramaic word Kamria. None of them come from Con. There's no way the Jew could misunderstand this. When they were reading the New Testament in Aramaic, which they did until about the 2nd or 3rd century, because the Greek was the translation of the last part of the first part of the second. The Latin didn't come in until the last part of the second, the first part of the third, and these other, the Syriac and all that. See, if we had a Syriac translation, then the problem would be over. And I have asked and cannot get it across to Brother Stanley, because in India they have the Syriac New Testament. But so far, I've not been able to get that across to him. He just cannot bridge the gap. One of these days I will. So this mind blower is that in the book of Leviticus, the Greek of the Levites is not used. And it is actually named very Kyle in the Hebrew. And by that word, we know that the first 3 words in the book are that we understand.
So how was the Aramaic used back in Genesis? I'm not getting it.
Thank you.
Are you trying to say the translation is off?
Like,
Because it's not connecting here either.
they wouldn't use the
Aramaic is
Aramaic
first,
back
and Greek, and
No, I asked him that. He said no.
In BC 6000, they spoke Phoenician. I thought I got this across last Wednesday night when I showed you that the name Cain meant this is the seed that God has promised me. And that Abel meant the perfect sacrifice. And that Eve meant the mother of all living. And I used Adam's translation of it to prove it. Now, in the Hebrew that's translated into the Greek, Cain is just Cain. This was no good.
Yeah, that's better. You can't really see it.
And so it's on now. The Aramaic began to be spoken about 600 to 450 BC because the Jews had been taken into Babylonian captivity. And the mixture of the languages produced Aramaic, which was the mixture of the Jewish Hebrew which, and I didn't write that down, came in at about 4000 BC to the 600. This was the language that Jesus spoke. I ran into this in a debate one day in college. I was on a debate team. And of course, when I'd go to speak somewhere, they'd try to let on like that I was an ignorant hillbilly because I still believed in God. So I had one of these scholars that got up and started making fun of me because I believed the Bible was the Word of God. And that nobody would have written anything in the first century unless it was poetic. If you've never heard of this, listen. It's true. If you've ever read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, it's poetry. It had rhyme and meter. And if you couldn't do it in rhyme and meter, you weren't considered a poet. Anything that was written that was of great value was written as a poem. Okay? Go back and look up your literature. I was fortunate enough to have a first minor in it, but I mean, that's the fact. And so his funny argument was that the Sermon on the Mount was a message by a buffoon instead of a God. Does it rhyme?
It does in Aramaic.
Oh, but you see, they didn't know that. You know what they'd read it in?
Their own language.
English and Greek.
Sure.
In English and Greek, there is no rhyme or meter to the Sermon on the Mount. But when you get to the Aramaic, it's perfect. It is one of the most flawless literary works that's ever been presented. Well, this old boy didn't know that. So you know how you lead the rat to the trap? And at the right time, you hope it's the right time. The cheese gets him to strike, and then he gets his head cut off. Well, I waited on the old boy. And he got up for 10 or 15 minutes, made fun of me, carried on. It was terrible. I didn't care. I knew what I was going to ask him. I was going to ask him if he spoke Aramaic. I was going to ask him if he ever knew what it was. I just barely found out. And fortunately, I had read this somewhere from somebody that was a preacher in the church. It may have been, I don't remember who it was. It could have been.
Probably Whiteside.
It probably was, because Whiteside was a scholar.
Yes.
He wasn't just, he was a scholar.
Great.
And that's probably where I got it. But I had the fortune of reading it. I saw the old boy never heard Aramaic, so I explained life to him. And so he didn't understand it. And so whoever I had read this from showed me that and explained to me, and like I have you, that if you are reading something in the original tongue, there is no definition to the words. But if you're not reading something and it's not in the original tongue, when you come across a word that the people that you've translated it for will not understand it unless you define the word. We agree?
Yeah.
For instance, when they sold the field, when they bought the field with Judas's money, what did they call the field?
Potters.
A kaldama. Okay, a kaldama is not a Greek word. So what is it that the author or the translators, what did they do?
They put both of them.
They translate, huh?
They put
Yeah.
both.
But they in parentheses they'll put a potter's field. Turn to Acts 1.
One of the things I've come with the last few days I've done is that they use the wrong synonym. There are several words in the Greek and the Hebrew, and I assume in the Aramaic, that mean the same thing. They don't sound the same way, so they've used, in my opinion, What they did in the King James was they used the wrong, many times they used the wrong word. And
For
that means that
reasons.
They used the word they thought was.
Well, that's the thing that's wrong with the NIV. And if you read the preface to the NIV, they'll tell you
Oh, yeah. I know
that that's what they did. They didn't even try to make it absolute and true.
Because none of them are linguists. They're not- none of them are probably
Let's see, where is it?
actual.
119.
20 or 19 to 20?
And sown unto all the dwellers of Jerusalem.
Yeah, start.
Much as the field is called in their proper tongue. Oh, I see what you're saying, okay. Solomon,
A Chaldema.
Calvin.
That is to say, the field
Okay.
that was bought.
Was written in the book
By
of
blood.
Psalms. Let his habitation be desolate. Let no man dwell therein.
Sure. So there's a lot of places that this is done. We just didn't pay any attention to it. Because we've been converted on the fact that the Greek language was the writing of the first century. Now, it was translated from the Aramaic to the Greek, but it was first in the Syriac, which is the same thing as the Aramaic. There's the Eastern, I've gone through this with you before, but there was the Eastern Syriac and there was the Western Syriac.
Sure.
The Eastern Syriac is the one that's right. The Western Syriac came about in about the 2nd century AD, and it's not right. It has a lot of problems. But the Syriac and the Aramaic are the same thing. I always, as a young preacher, would run into this, well, if you go back to the Syriac translation, I'd go back if you'd help me to get there. I just couldn't, so I'd ask, man, where do you get a Syriac translation? Nobody knew. Well, I mean, every scholar that had written will mention the Syriac tongue. Well, what was the Syriac tongue? It was the language that they spoke in Syria from the 3rd or 4th century BC till about the 2nd or 3rd AD, if I'm correct. So that means that being real close to the Jews, they were all speaking the same language. All them boys over there speak the same language. You'd be surprised how close the modern language that the Muslims use is the language of the Syriac people. We call it today Arabic. Because nobody would know what we was talking about with Syriac. I've run into some Syrians lately in the business that I'm in, and I'll ask them, can you give me what this word is? No, but Mama can. I'll call her and ask her. Because she's still living in Syria. And it's quite interesting. And in studying, I found out that if we could, there are still those people who copy the Syriac translation of the New Testament. And if you could get one, you'd be miles ahead of the cavalry. Although what we've got in the King James, and I quit trying to make a distinction because it just is so confusing, I just go and say Greek. But a lot of times I'm defining the word in the Syriac or the Aramaic, or to be more exact, in the Peshitta. Now, the Peshitta was the translation that the Jews made for themselves from our scholarship. Now, of course, what I'm telling you occurs in the Peshitta, just like it does in the Aramaic. They knew. So when Paul would talk about Jesus being a priest after the order of Melchizedek, he didn't mention Levi at all. And we, because we don't know better and haven't thought, and nobody's brought it to our attention, more than likely, and I'd say that's all true from all of us that are here. Read Exodus 2:16. Somebody read Exodus 3:1. Somebody else read Exodus 18:1. I just want to show you that this word is here. In the Peshitta Tanakh, they call it the Peshitta Tanakh. which is the translation of the Jews. It translates Cohen as Cumria regarding these men.
Exodus 2:16.
Genesis 14:18. We read it. Exodus 2:16.
It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock.
Okay, the priest of Midian. And now read the 3rd chapter and the 1st verse.
And it says, where's my phone go? Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian.
And it doesn't say high priest then. Okay. But it uses the word priest. All right, he was a priest. And how in the world would this dude be a priest? I mean, Moses just got to town. How could he make him a priest? How did that work? Because it never made any sense to me. And if you'll study and find out that the word priest was not used but one time or two from from Adam all the way to Exodus. But then it's used a blithering thousands of times because it was referring to the priest of the Levite origination. But when we get to the New Testament, the Lord did us a real favor and gave us an argument that we could use to show the truth. You got 18:1? Genesis 18:1?
I can. Genesis 18:1. It says, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre.
Mamre.
And he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, there 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground, and said, my Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant.
Now see, they completely translated it out of that. Read that again. Tell me, what word do you think has the word priest in it?
From which verse to which verse?
First verse. Because it's definitely there in Hebrew. And all I'm trying to do is to show you that what the New Testament is showing us is with the proper translation. Nobody would have ever been confused thinking that the priesthood that we have is anything like the priesthood of the Jew. And that the priesthood that we have, they had amongst the patriarchs by name, not by qualification. They were priests like Melchizedek was, but it wasn't of Jewish origin or origination.
It says in my Webster A here, at first men functioned as their own priests in Genesis 4:3, but later the patriarchal head of the family performed the task.
But they weren't called priests.
Melchizedek and Jethro were the first priests to be mentioned in the Old Testament. In a sense, all Israelites were priests of the Lord. That's what it's saying here.
Until he made Levi the priestly tribe. And that's where we came up with the name. All right.
It says, however, at Mount Sinai, God designated the priesthood.
It's an interesting thing that this cements a point that we had never, ever comprehended. So when he talks about Melchizedek, and somebody will say he was a Jew, what's the first thing you're going to say? Wrong word. Now, I got in that discussion today, and I got a few minutes. Let me show you. I proved to you, I hope you understood, that Melchizedek was the high priest. And the reason is that his name was Japheth. And that the reason he wasn't a Jew is because his brother Seth was younger than he. And the high priest was the one that was kin to everybody in the world at that time. They were answerable to him. And because of the war in the Valley of Kings that Abraham took his army, which he trained, which were his servants, and his sheep herders. Abraham just didn't mess around and said, we'll take the night off. He got out and taught them maneuvers. And the Bible says he took his shepherds and his sheep herders, and he went and beat the britches off of 5 kings in the Valley of Kings. And when he got done, and he was on his way back, and of course he retrieved Lot. On his way back, he went back to Jerusalem, which we call Salem. And there Melchizedek came out to greet him, the king of Salem and the prince of peace, with the first derivatives or the first mention of the bread and the cup, which were a figure of things to come. And so when all that took place, Abraham, who was joined by some Gentile people now, there was a bunch of people that joined Abraham. And they went over there and they whipped up on them 5 kings because they'd come into Sodom and Gomorrah and those plains, city of the plains, and they'd take some captives out. And they made a mistake and got our boy Lot, who was Abraham's wife's brother and Abraham's nephew, because Lot was the son of Abraham's brother, Haran, or Haran, or however you want to pronounce it. So that's kind of the derivative for all that. Now, what I'm talking about now is a New Testament defense of the same argument. Turn with me to the book of Hebrews, the 7th chapter. I want to let you read something, and I'll let you read it first, and then we'll try to explain it.
7.
Hebrews 7. And let's see. Let's start. And tonight I was going to go into this, but we'll go into it next week. Let's start. Let's just read from verse 1 to verse 5. Go ahead.
For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him.
Now, guess what that word priest there is in the Aramaic? Kumriah. Has nothing to do with Levi. Keep going.
To whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness.
Now, what is that by interpretation? That means we're in a different language. And what language this meant this in was what? Probably the Phoenician. And spilled over into the Hebrew. It meant by interpretation, king of Salem. Keep going.
King of righteousness. And after
King of
that,
peace.
also king of Salem, which is king of peace.
Right.
Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither being of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually.
And don't say that the Melchizedekian priesthood was greater than the priesthood of which we are a participant, because the Melchizedekian priesthood was defined as, so we could call it that. But the Mormons got this all messed up. Keep going.
Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the 10th of the spoils. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the lines of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises.
Now, there's the verses. You give me the argument.
What's the question?
There's the verses. Give me the argument that proves that Melchizedek was not Seth.
He had no father or mother.
Those whose descent is not counted and received the tithes of Abraham. It identifies who they are. Right?
You're getting close. Keep going.
unless there's even any promises.
Read the first line of the 6th verse.
That's where I'm at.
He whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham.
If Abraham came from Seth, and Paul says that those who are from Abraham are not of this type of priesthood, that would mean that Melchizedek could not be Seth. Because it would have said, hey, these are the boys that Abraham came from, because he's from Seth. Read it again. Verse 5 and 6.
And verily they are the sons of Levi, who received the office of the priesthood.
Now, who was Levi?
Levi was the priesthood.
Yeah, and he was the son of Jacob. And who was Jacob? The son of Isaac. And who was Isaac? The son of Abraham. And who was Abraham? The son of nobody. Really, his daddy, his name was Tame. Was
Terah.
it
Terah.
Terah? Right. Who was Terah? He worshipped idols. But go ahead.
Let me start again. Verily they are the sons of Levi, who received the office of the priesthood. Now you're saying that word priesthood is not the same as Cumera.
Come No, here, this word priesthood is the same as the Greek word.
Which it just says Levi received the office of that.
Because he was of the office of the descendants of Abraham and Levi.
Had a commandment to take the tithes of the people according to the law. That is, of their brethren. So they come out of the loins of Abraham.
But Abraham, whose descent is not counted.
He whose descent is not counted from them.
Okay, who was the he?
Abraham.
Christ. Christ, whose descent is not counted from Abraham. Because Christ received the blessings. Now, who was the representative of Christ?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. So Melchizedek was not Seth. Melchizedek was Japheth. For another reason. Last week, if you'll remember, it's because that Japheth was older. Remember?
Yeah.
In Genesis 10. And Japheth was still around kicking. We don't know if Seth was still alive or not, but it wouldn't matter. But the fact is that Japheth was older. He was the high priest.
Seth wasn't alive because after the flood, he died.
Who?
If he was alive, he'd have been killed in the flood. 'Cause
Seth?
Yeah, because only 8 survived after the flood, correct?
Yeah, but Seth was one of the 8.
No, he wasn't.
I believe he was.
Seth is on the ark.
Now,
Yeah, I believe it was. Sham, I'm sorry. Thank you.
So
You gotta keep me straight.
So Seth wasn't alive then.
No, Sham.
Yeah, but we're not talking about Shan.
Yeah.
So Seth would have been dead post flood.
Okay, yeah, I'm
So
using,
Seth would not have been alive.
using the wrong word.
Thank you, Michael.
It was Sham.
Right.
Sham was the guy. It was Ham, Shem, and Japheth.
Sure.
And why they put Japheth last is because of another thing we get into, but one of these days. But go ahead. And the commandment was that the greater receives the tithes from the lesser. So who was greater, Abraham or Melchizedek?
Greater was Melchizedek.
All right. And if Melchizedek was the greater, then the lesser gave him the tithes. Who was the father of the Jewish people?
Abraham.
Abraham. So the father of the Jewish people was not as great as Melchizedek, who was a type or a representative of the high priest of God over the whole world.
Sure.
It has to be somebody else. You may not like for the fact that it's Japheth, but you give me another one's name. It wasn't Ham, because Ham tried to play the part of a homosexual. And he got booted out. Verse 6.
Oh, man. I got it, man. But he whose descent is not counted from him, Abraham, received tithes of Abraham. blessed him that had the promises. So the promises are greater than
Yeah, and look at verse 7.
the
And look-
promises. Those that had the promise, or had the secret, or had the plan, are greater than,
Sure.
or were greater than, and are greater than those that had the genetic line.
Right, now read verse 7.
And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better.
All right. So Melchizedek was better, greater than Abraham. And Abraham was of the seed of Shem, who, by the way, to be frankly factual, was of the seed of Seth, because that's where Noah came from. So I was using the wrong guy, but actually, technically, it could be correct, but it's not proving the point that I was trying to prove. Okay. You got it? You get it?
I get everything except for the Aramaic and Genesis. I get the rest of it though.
So
When you said good evening, I was lost.
Usually in the Hebrew language, you'll find that other word used. It's an Aramaic word, but you'll use that other word not applied to Levi and his descendants and the priesthood. So, okay, that I can buy, that I understand.
so you're trying to say there's two different words.
I'm not trying to. I'm just telling you what the Hebrew language uses.
So you are trying, because that's what you're presenting to us. Okay, so you are trying to explain that there are two different words for priesthood, right? But the Hebrew and Greek don't provide that. is what
The
you're saying.
Hebrew does, but the
Well-
Greek translation doesn't.
So then why do the verses from the pre-Levitical priesthood, like Genesis, Genesis
Yeah, how
14,
would you use
18, it uses the word Cohen. When you look it up in the,
Because it's coming from a translation of 1050 AD.
okay, so how would we know? is what
You
I'm saying.
won't. That's what I started off with.
Okay, all right, we're back to square one. All right.
There's no way you'd know.
This is something that you would learn from
But
study.
you're saying,
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mike, didn't mean to catch
so
you.
how would you look that up? You know what I mean? How would you find that?
Go to the Hebrew and look up the word that's used in the actual place, and you'll see how it's translated.
That's what I'm saying. If you look up the Greek word and you look up the Hebrew word, they're both translated
But you
as
can't
priesthood.
come from a Hebrew translation of 1050 or 1600 AD. You have to go back to the Septuagint,
Okay.
which was not a translation from them, but it's a translation of the 2nd century BC.
So, in reality, the Hebrew should have two different words.
It does.
So why weren't those two different words used? Or why does it refer to the
Because they
same?
didn't even know the Septuagint existed. And they took a translation from the 1050 AD translation, which was from by that Roman Catholic priest, and I've been trying to think of the idiot's name, that did the translation in the last part of the 9th and the 10th century, and that's where most of this mess came
You're
from.
talking about Jerome.
Now you're saying
No,
that,
Jerome was the 3rd century.
so now you're saying that Aramaic has both words.
Yes.
So if you had an Aramaic translation, you'd see one word written in some of these verses and the other word written in other verses.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I got that. Okay.
So how come you don't have both words on the board?
Because the New Testament's been translated by
Both
the King
words in
James.
Aramaic,
Well, we don't have an Aramaic Bible.
but you have one word on the board.
Yeah, because they took the word priest as the word Cohen has been
So those words all mean the same thing on the board.
Yes, it's just from different languages.
So what's the word in the Aramaic that means something else?
Qumran.
No, you just said that there's the three words on the board all mean the same word.
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Three different languages.
Not exactly, so let me be definitive. You want to tie it down to a discussion of the debate, we'll do it this way. I wrote it down here, I thought. This was a word which was not from the Phoenician, but this was a word that came from the fact that this had a derivative in the tribe of Levi. And that's what the word itself means.
So what does that word mean then?
It doesn't have anything from the tribe of Levi. It's just the word priest.
So then why put it with the other two?
How was I going to explain it?
But you're saying now also the Aramaic has another word that means priesthood that has a different definition. So what's the second word in Aramaic and what's the second definition?
The second word in Aramaic is kana, or kohen.
Those are Hebrew and Greek words.
Mhm.
I'm asking for an Aramaic word that means the second thing. What's the second Aramaic word?
Is there an Aramaic word that
They use
denotes-
kana.
Is there an Aramaic
That
word?
is the word that's used in Aramaic when that
You're
word is
pointing
used.
to a Greek word. I'm asking for two Aramaic words. Kumrea would be one. Number two would be some other word in Aramaic. Correct?
No.
If you're saying I looked at an Aramaic Bible right now, this was Aramaic. On one verse in the beginning of the Bible, it said priesthood, and it said that word, kumrea. But in another area, in the same Aramaic Bible, the second word in the New Testament would have to be the different word. What word would that be?
If you're using the Aramaic, it would be the same word as it was in the Hebrew. If it was the right translation.
Okay,
it's
but if I'm reading an Aramaic Bible, it would be two different words.
Yeah.
You
But
only
it'd be
have
the
one
same.
of the four.
It'd be the same word. It'd be the same word about Melchizedek as it is the child of God, Kumria.
So why is
If
it
you were
called-
talking about the priesthood of the Levites, it would be the same word as kana, which
Is
was the
there-
Greek
But
translation.
what is the word in Aramaic? I'm reading Aramaic now, don't forget. This verse says that word. This verse should say another word. What's the other word?
Kumria.
That was what the Old Testament said.
Is there an Aramaic word that designates the descendants of Levi in the priesthood? I think that's what he's asking.
Kana.
No, but that's a Greek
It's a
word.
Greek word.
If
That's
I'm
where
reading
he's at.
Aramaic,
Why is it going from the Aramaic to the Greek?
Well, I just put this up here to help you.
okay,
We got it now.
Kana and Cohen are one Aramaic word
Now
for the
there's three now.
priesthood of the Levitical sense. Komria is the Aramaic word for the priesthood of Melchizedek.
Melchizedek.
That makes more
I
sense.
understand that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, so Kumria means Melchizedek, priesthood, correct? In the Aramaic language, Kumria means Melchizedekian priesthood.
Yeah.
So in Aramaic, what word means Levitical priesthood?
There you go.
Kumra.
Okay, I don't see that one. That's the one that I've been asking for.
It's the one that's used all the time in the Old Testament, except for these 3 or 4 instances.
Okay, so what's the difference in their English translation of both of those words?
It's according to what translation you're reading. There are correct differences. The Kumra means that you have a derivative in Levi. Kumria means you don't.
How do you spell Qumran?
It's Kumrah.
The guy that you were talking about in the 9th century, I know this is kind of,
Boza or something, wasn't it Biza?
I've got Charlemagne Magne or
That's Charlemagne.
whatever,
That's 5th century.
Ansgar.
I think this cat's name was Beza, B-E-Z-A. Look him up. I don't know why, I just thought about it. All right, let me read you this right from this book that I've studied. It goes like this. This verse is nothing short of genius in the Aramaic. This is Hebrews 3:1. Yeshua, that means the Messiah, Christ.
Sure.
Yeshua, because he was not from the tribe of Levi, though Joseph, through Joseph's line, is not being called Cohen, but Kumria, a non-Levitical priest like Jethro instead. This is very important because it goes to the messianic prophecies that deal with the Messiah being like a priest after Melchizedek, Psalms 110. And interestingly enough, the Peshitta Tanakh consistently translates Cohen as Kumria regarding these same men.
So depending on the century.
It's according to the accuracy of the translation. But you see, by it being inaccurately translated, you get into trouble.
Yeah, I guess somebody else
Yep, and there's 24 times that the word priest is used in the book of Hebrews. And it always comes from the word kamria in the Hebrew. According to him, I've not run it all 24 times. I looked it up 2 or 3 times. And
We're not arguing with you, we're trying to get to,
Mike is.
we're trying.
I'm not arguing. I understand what he's saying, but it's not making sense. So in order for me to understand it, I have to break it down that
What
way.
I'm saying,
I
is we're
can't
trying to get to
understand
the point that you want to try and get us to, and I'm not there yet either. I got about half of it, so. What page are you on? I got that book.
oh, 334.
Let me go,
No, 338.
The guy,
I'll go home and decipher that.
Excuse me, I'll say it one more time. 358.
the guy in the 5th century, he was in the 5th century, not the 9th.
Visa?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Codex, Visa, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce that name.
Sinaiticus?
No, Canta, or Genesis.
Yeah, he gave his life in translating the Bible.
Designated by Siglum, Siglum, Siglum.
Sigla.
That's what I got. It contains both Greek and Latin, most of the 4 Gospels and the Acts, and a small fragment of 3rd John in the Codex.
Uh-oh.
That's it.
Number 347, would you stand, please?